We're going to start talking about the heart today. So bear with me, we're going to get going. Okay, like I said, we're going to be talking about the heart today. I've got kind of a simplistic drawing of it here, even more simple here, but we're going to be talking about the cardiac ventricular muscle and the SA node, the action potentials that are happening there, the channels, the ion currents, and the membrane potentials that are involved in the action potentials in each of those different cells. We're going to then talk about ECGs, how they're made, what they're describing. We'll talk a little bit about an NSTEMI and a STEMI, what's different between the two, why they look the way they do. Then we're going to move on. We're going to talk about ionotropic, lusotropic, and chronotropic effects or actions of cholinergic, catecholamines and acetylcholine. Then we're going to move on to talking about we're going to be talking about the cardiac cycle. I'm sorry, I lost my place there. But yeah, so there's a lot to discuss. I'm going to try to get us through it as quickly as possible. So just really quickly, some basic understanding of the heart here. We have a right atrium and a left atrium. Those are like little rooms that the blood is stored before they're pumped into the right ventricle and left ventricle, respectively. Okay, and then in the ventricle, it's then pumped out of the heart to the rest of the body. From the right ventricle, it goes into the pulmonary arteries, which takes it deoxygenated blood to the heart to be oxygenated, and then the left atrium is filled with oxygenated blood, which is pumped into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then pumps blood out through the aorta. Okay, and then that's oxygenated blood all the way to our body, all throughout our body, if that's a better way of saying it. Some special features on the heart that we're going to be discussing a lot today are our SA node and our AV node. These are those nodal cells that contract basically by themselves. They don't have an resting membrane potential, as we'll see in just a second. So the depolarization of the heart cells, of the muscle cells, all starts in the SA node. That's why it's known as the pacemaker. Okay, so here's a little more simplistic drawing right down here. And like I said, the nodal cells, those are in your SA and your AV nodes. They're autorhythmic, so they're just doing their own thing. They're setting the pace here. And then you have your contractile cells or your myocytes, okay? And that's what's causing the heart to squeeze. Those are the muscle cells that are just contracting and squeezing and causing blood to go flow through your body, okay? So in your heart, like I said, atriums, ventricles, and then we have this intraventricular septum. It's just a muscle wall, a wall of muscle here between the two ventricles, okay? I've got the SA node here, AV node here. This AV node has a connection from the right atrium to the left atrium, and that just helps with the depolarizing of the whole atrium, of all the atriums in general, both the atriums. And then the AV node also interacts here with the AV node. And the AV node kind of slows down the signal to contract right here, just for a little bit, so that these both contract completely before the ventricles then contract. Okay, so that's what the AV node slows it down. And then the AV node depolarizes and sends the signal down here to what's called the bundle of His, or His, I guess. And then that bundle then sends the signal to contract in the ventricles. Okay, so then it sends it down these pathways, and these are called Purkinje fibers, and they're just all straight down here along in the muscle walls of our ventricles. Okay, so we have these two different types of cells. We have autorhythmic and we have the contractile cells. Okay, I'm going to start with the autorhythmic. These are kind of different from what we've talked about in the past, right? Usually we have a resting membrane potential someplace that it sits at, and then it has, this graded potential, and then it has an action potential, and then it comes down and it hyperpolarizes for just a second, and then it reaches RMP again, and then it can have another graded potential, action potential, right? That's kind of what we're used to looking at. Now these, however, these autorhythmic or nodal cells are different. They don't have a resting membrane potential. And what makes it really unique is that these nodal cells have what's called a funny channel or an HCN channel. Okay, so what happens is when a cell is repolarized, as soon as it gets down here, these IF channels, funny channels, HCN channels, whatever you want to call it, they automatically start to depolarize the cell again. And so then it gets back up here to threshold, and then we have our action potential. Okay? So they just automatically, as soon as the cell is repolarized, it just automatically starts to depolarize it. Kind of interesting. Not what we've seen. So this just looks like a wave. It just goes boom, 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 just all the way across. So they just never stop working. They're constant, okay? Now, what happens when it hits the threshold? These T-type calcium and L-type calcium channels, they open up. So what's interesting is we're not seeing any voltage-gated sodium channels here in these nodal cells, which is another difference. They're almost always voltage-gated sodium channels associated with action potentials, right? But these will just be calcium. The T-type and L-type, the T-type stands for transient, which means it's super fast. So those just open up right away. But then the L-type, they're a little bit slower, but they open up. They both open up right down here. Just as soon as it hits threshold, they both open up. T-type, I think, technically opens first slightly, but it's not a huge difference. Okay, so then those calcium channels open up, and we have our action potential. We reach the peak, right? Those calcium channels then close, and we have a voltage-gated potassium channel that opens up, and then we start to repolarize. Okay, so as you can see here, there's only 3 phases to these nodal cells. We have phase 4, phase 0, and phase 3. So phase 4 is our graded potential, phase 0 is the depolarization, and then phase 3 is the repolarization. And it just starts right back over, starting with 4. Okay, so that's kind of interesting to see the difference on how these action potentials work on these nodal cells. Okay, so then these nodal cells, what's interesting, right, we're starting with the SA node. These nodal cells are then connected to contractile cells. So as they send a signal for the action potential, this signal then goes into the contractile cells. Okay. Now these also look different than previous action potentials that we've seen. Okay, so we have phases 4, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So we have 5 phases on this one. Okay. Same thing, 4 is the graded potential. 0 now is the action potential, and as you'll see, we have our friends, the voltage-gated sodium channels, back. So anything in the heart, though, we're dealing with currents in the heart, so a lot of these are going to be I something. I just means current. Okay. So the INA, they're just referencing that voltage-gated sodium channels are opening. They're just called INA channels in the heart, though. So those open up. We reach our maximum, our peak here at 1. And at 1, we have ITO1 and ITO2 channels that open up. ITO1 channels, let me see here. Oh, I got it right here. Okay, ITO1, they are potassium-gated channels. They open up, causing potassium to leave the cell. And then we have their calcium-regulated chloride channels open up. Okay, so that's what causes this start to the depolarization. But as you can see, there's kind of this plateau where it just kind of flattens out for a little bit. And that's because we have these calcium channels that open up, or ICA channels. So those calcium channels stay open for a while, and they're kind of counteracting the effects of these guys trying to repolarize the cell. So it stays depolarized for a little while. Okay, and the reason for this is to make sure that the heart has time to fully contract and then fully relax. Because as we learned in skeletal muscle, there's a point where if a muscle is receiving so many action potentials, it just stays in a state of what's called tetany, right? So it just stays contracted. We don't want that to happen in the heart. We don't want it to stay contracted if it's receiving a bunch of action potentials, because otherwise that means the heart stops beating. It stops contracting. It stops doing things. If it just stays contracted, right? So that's not good. So that's why we have this plateau phase, is it allows our body, our heart to relax so that it can then contract again. Okay? So that's why this plateau phase is so important to our heart. Now, at the same time, to get us out of the plateau phase, we have this IKUR, IKR, and IKS. These are potassium channels that open up. This is IKUR is ultra rapid, IKR is rapid, and IKS is slow. So these open up, and they finally kind of overcome the ICA. All right, and so then we have our full-on repolarization. And at this point, we have IK1 channels that open up. Now, what's cool about IK1 is they are super permeable to potassium. So much so that potassium reaches its nursed RMP, which is -90. So basically, potassium is just constantly leaving the cell. So that's why we don't see any hyperpolarization here. It just gets down to -90 and it just sits there. Kind of cool. So that's our RMP. Because of the IK1, RMP is -90 in the heart. Okay, so now we're going to kind of move on to what it looks like in our heart. We're going to talk about ECGs here. Okay, so ECGs, they're not measuring action potentials. What they're measuring is the charges on the outside of the cell, or in the ECF, I guess. So normally, on the inside of a cell, it's negative, right? And then it's positive on the outside. So when it's depolarized, when a cell is depolarized, I'll draw it out. If we have a cell that's depolarized, then all of a sudden, we start getting a bunch of positive, right? Because we have an influx of sodium. That's usually the case, right? And so then our cell becomes more positive. That's what causes depolarization, which then leads to an action potential, right? So what the cell would then be, or what an ECG's detectors would be finding or detecting, I guess, would be an increase in negative charges in the ECF. Okay, so now if we're talking about coming from the SA node here, it starts this depolarization. Our ECG sees these negative, or detects these negative charges coming off here, and it recognizes, oh, it's coming out from right here. Okay, and so if we look at this, this is kind of like I've got 4 cells here in a row that you can see, and I've already got one that's starting to depolarize, right? And so at this point, if I have a graph here, right here at this point, we're going to see a little blip up. Now, if this also depolarizes, so the negatives come out, positives go in, we're going to see it go up even higher. Now, this one comes in. Now, we don't have as much of a concentration gradient, but it's still above this, what's called isoelectric point, or where it's at rest. So if it's on this line, then it's at rest, or it's at the isoelectric point. Okay, so then finally, if this one depolarizes, then we'd be back at our isoelectric point, because now everything would be positive inside and then everything would be negative on the outside. I hope that kind of made sense. One of the rules for an ECG is that if you have a negative tail, negative, pointing towards your positive terminal or your positive sensor, then your wave is going to be upright. Now, if we switched these to positive and negative, well, that didn't look good. Then we had a negative tail to a negative sensor, then we would have an upside down wave. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, but so it should be opposite. We should see that it's going in the opposite direction. Or sorry, that charges should be going opposite. If not, if we see an upside down wave, either somebody placed the sensors in the wrong spot, switched up the positive and negative, so put a negative here and a positive there, or something in the heart is off. Okay. So this is just kind of the placement that I've got drawn here. Normally we put our sensor pads, our negative terminal here, our positive terminal here, because when you're looking at kind of the overall direction that the current is flowing in the heart, it starts in the SA node and it kind of moves in this direction, right? It's spreading out. It's in a big radius from here, right? But if we took ropes and started pulling, then this would move in this general direction, kind of straight towards this positive node. Now, for this case, I'm only talking about lead 2. There are technically 12 leads in an ECG that we can have. For this, and for simplicity, I'm just going to be talking about lead 2. Okay? So what happens is SA node goes off, right? Depolarizes. And then we have this full contraction of the atrium, right? And what we want is the atrium to contract first and finish filling up the ventricles, so that then when the ventricles then contract, they're maximally filled and can then expel blood in the directions that they need to go. Okay, so let's take a look at this ECG. This is kind of what an ECG looks like. All right. So our P wave is the first thing that we're going to see. The P wave is when our atriums contract. So we're going to see a blip here, and that was just what I was drawing up above. We see that the first little bit contracts, and then as more contracts, and then so like right here, half of the atrium is contracted, now 3/4, now the whole thing. Okay, and so that's kind of the P wave that we see. Now, once that P wave has hit, or has all happened, now the AV node kicks in right about here in this area. Okay, and then what it does is, if you come up here, this AV node sends the signal to this bundle of His. I don't know how to say it really. But as you can see, it's right here on the left ventricle's wall. Okay, and so it has to go this far here and only just start going down right here. So when this originally starts sending the conductance, starts depolarizing, it has this direction going. Okay, so it's kind of going in this direction. And if we take a line straight from here to here, this angle is smaller than this angle, right? So it's kind of pointed. So we have a negative tail pointing more towards the negative terminal than towards the positive terminal, which is why we see this upside down little blip here. Okay, and this is the Q wave. So this Q wave is basically the bundle of His. Firing, depolarizing. Okay. Now, once that happens, it really does come across here pretty quick. It's just the first little bit, and that's why that Q piece of the ECG is so small, is because it only takes a second for this to catch up here. Okay, and then after that, we're back to normal. We're back pointed in this direction. So this is all starting to fill up. Okay, those Purkinje fibers are depolarizing, and so our whole our ventricles are depolarizing. Now, that's why we have this big R wave, this big R peak, because those are such massive muscles, and they have so much force in their contraction. So that's what this big R wave is for, R peak, I'm sorry. Now when we get to S here, what's happening is this last piece right here is the last thing to be depolarized. Okay, and so we have these, again, kind of pointing in this direction. So then it is pointed again like this. And again, this angle is smaller than this angle. So it's once again kind of pointed more towards the negative sensor than it is towards the positive sensor. So that's why we have this upside down blip here for the S wave, is it's just finishing off completely depolarizing the ventricles. Okay, and then the T wave right here happens as our heart repolarizes. Now, what's interesting is when the heart depolarizes, it depolarizes from the endocardium towards the epicardium. Okay, so in to out. But then when the heart repolarizes, we go out to in. So we go from epicardium to endocardium. So then we're doing positive, because repolarization would mean that the positives are now coming back to the outside of the cell, and we're going back in this direction. Okay, back towards the negative. So we have a positive tail to a negative sensor. So it's an upward curve, right? And that's what we see here with this what I've drawn here for this T wave. So what's interesting and important to remember is that endocardium has a longer plateau phase than epicardium does. So these are the contractile cells, right? So for epicardium, we'd see something like this. The plateau phase isn't quite as long as the endocardium. Kind of interesting. but that's how that works. So if we had something that was going wrong, and on our endocardium right here, and it repolarized before the epicardium, then we would have an upside down T wave. Okay, and so that would lead us to start thinking about what some things might be going wrong. We could think that there's maybe low blood volume, or low blood oxygen, or hypoxia, something like that could be causing this T wave to be flipped upside down, meaning that endocardium is repolarizing before the epicardium. So now we're going to talk about the STEMI and the end STEMI. We'll talk about the end STEMI first, okay? So like I said, this is the end STEMI, okay? So if this is the left ventricle, we're just looking straight at the left ventricle. It pumps blood out, right? And the blood comes along here, and it has to have these little blood vessels that go into the cardiac muscle to feed it, right? Because this blood actually doesn't leak out and feed it. It has to come all the way out and then back in. Kind of interesting, but that's just how the heart works. Okay. So for an end STEMI, let's say we had a clot here, right? And so blood isn't able to just sneak on by as well as it should, right? And the clot can move down. So there's still this gap, right? But it's not great for our heart. So this area of the endocardium, as you can kind of see that I've drawn there, is starting to have hypoxia. It's in danger of dying, right? And so what we see is that we have all these negative cells because they're not repolarizing. They don't have the oxygen. So we have a negative tail to a positive terminal. Okay, so we're going to see this jump. So this might be normal. If this is a normal ECG, then we would see a jump here in our RMP from where it normally is. And this is called a background current of injury. So when you see an elevation and a background current of injury, we're probably dealing with an end STEMI. It raises the baseline. Okay. Now, what happens here is after we have our Q, R, and then S drops all the way down to the old baseline. And then what happens is it comes slowly all the way back up. So it's called an ST depression because the S is lower than the T. Now with a STEMI, our clot has completely occluded our blood vessel here, right? So blood is no longer getting down here to help this area of our heart. It's dying. It's called a transmural myocardial infarction. Transmural means completely through the wall, right? Like a mural is a drawing on a wall. Trans is through or across. And then, so myocardial is the muscles in the heart muscles. So this is the basically death of this entire section of wall. Okay, so now this is no longer able to say, oh, I'm going this way, but instead it's a negative tail, and it's now pointing in this direction because all of this is still positive, all of this is still positive. So now it's kind of pulling in this direction rather than in this direction. So then what we're going to see is a fall from the baseline, lowering the baseline. Okay. So then we're going to have our normal ECG. It's going to come up here. And then our S wave is going to stop at the previous baseline. okay? And then we're going to see a big drop down to our T wave. And that's why it's called an ST elevation, because S is now above T. Now STEMI is that's no bueno, no good. Okay, so that's the difference between a STEMI and an NSTEMI. NSTEMI, we have partial death of some cells, partial hypoxia, and then STEMI is complete transmural. This whole section of muscle from the endo to the epi is dead, and that's no good. Okay. We're going to talk about some flow charts for inotropic, lusotropic, and chronotropic actions. So in the contractile cells, I just kind of have this drawn out to show you, just to remind you that this is the contractile cells. Okay. Now they deal only with inotropy and lusotropy. Inotropy is the force of the contraction, and lusotropy is the speed of relaxation. That's what that's dealing with. So what happens here in the contractile cells is we have a GPCR, right? So a G proteins have, there's a receptor, and then we have the three subunits. Okay, so epinephrine or norepinephrine, dopamine, adrenaline, whatever you want to say, catecholamines, something will bind here, right? And then our alpha subunit will come down, activate adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase creates CAMP, and then CAMP activates phosphokinase A, or PKA. Now, PKA does a couple of different things. First of all, these green lines, okay, these are affecting inotropy, the force of contraction, okay? So PKA either comes here and phosphorylates the L-type calcium channels, so that allows calcium to come in, and then that triggers contraction, right? If we have a whole bunch more calcium, then our contraction is harder, stronger. Or PKA comes here and phosphorylates the RYR channel in our SR, right? We talked about that in skeletal muscle. There's no DHP for cardiac muscles, it's just the RYR, ryanodine. So then there's a lot more calcium inside the muscle now. And again, calcium is always associated with muscle contraction. So the more calcium, the more contraction, right? PKA also helps with the speed of relaxation by, if PKA comes over here, it will kick off calcium from troponin C. I think it binds to troponin I, and then that kicks off calcium from troponin C, and that increases the speed of relaxation and decreases the duration of contraction, right? If we're getting rid of this calcium on our troponin molecule, then that means tropomyosin is then covering up the actin active sites. So myosin can no longer bind to actin, which means no more contraction. PKA can also come over here, and it will phosphorylate what's called phospholambdin. Phospholambdin inhibits the circuit pumps. So if we get rid of the phospholambdin, then we increase lusotropy, or relaxation, right? Because circuit pumps, what they do is they pull the calcium back into the SR. So if we get rid of what inhibits the SR, so it just is pulling calcium back in, then we're decreasing the duration of contraction, and we're increasing speed of relaxation again. So that's kind of what's happening in the contractile cells for ionotropy and lusotropy. It's kind of hard to understand, but I hope that made sense. So we're going to move on to the autorhythmic or the nodal cells now. And again, this is what those look like. Again, there's no RMP for these guys. They're just constantly going because of those HCN, IF, whatever you want to call it, the funny channel. Those are just causing them to constantly depolarize as soon as they've repolarized. Okay, so these guys, we have two different things that are going on. And these are affecting chronotropy, the time or our heart rate, right? So they can increase the steepness of phase 4, so it gets us to threshold faster. So we have action potentials faster, or it can make it go slower, or it can increase their threshold. It can decrease our threshold. There's lots of different things that it can do. Okay, so what we're going to look at here. So again, GPCR, catecholamine comes and binds. Alpha subunit comes, activates adenylyl cyclase, creates CAMP. CAMP creates PKA, or activates PKA, I'm sorry. PKA decreases threshold, right? So if we're looking at this, and our normal threshold is here, we'll say, for the kicks and giggles, it decreases threshold. So if it decreases threshold, we're going to have an action potential sooner than we otherwise would, right? That's kind of what happens if we decrease threshold. And then PKA can also steepen the slope of phase 0. So instead of it being kind of like that, it could be straighter. So again, faster. Okay. And what it's doing, PKA is, or CAMP can also come down here. HCN stands for hyperpolarization cyclic nucleotide. Hyperpolarized cyclic nucleotide. So CAMP is a cyclic nucleotide. So if we have a whole bunch of CAMP, it'll come over here and activate our HCN channel, which will have an increase in our sodium influx, which, as we all know, depolarizes our cells very effectively. So then if that happened, if our HCN channels are activated, we're going to have an increase in the slope. So the slope is going to be steeper. So again, we're going to reach threshold faster than we otherwise would, right? Which would increase our heart rate. If we're having more action potentials sooner and faster, then we're going to see an increase in heart rate, right? Now, these are beta 1 receptors that we've been talking about, okay? They deal with the catecholamines, if you'll remember from some of my first videos. Now, we also have muscarinic receptors that deal with acetylcholine, right? And that's what we're dealing with over here. Now, these are inhibitors. They slow things down. They slow down our heart. So what happens here is acetylcholine comes in, binds to our M2, muscarinic 2 receptor. And this works a little different than normal. The beta and the gamma subunits actually work together. They're called a heterodimer, and they open what's called the GERK channel. And that's basically just a potassium channel. So then what happens is the potassium leaves, and we have hyperpolarization. So this will go lower than normal because we have this potassium channel that's opened. Okay, and so if we go lower, then that basically means that threshold got higher. You know, it's either way. Either we hyperpolarize, so we're farther away from normal threshold, or we can just think of it as threshold got farther away. So then if threshold's harder to reach or takes longer to reach, then we have less action potentials, which means a slower heart rate, essentially, right? Now, that was what this heterodimer does with the beta and gamma subunits. Alpha subunit can come over here, turn off our adenylyl cyclase, which means we turn off camp. Okay, so adenylyl cyclase causes a decrease, the alpha subunit causes a decrease in camp, which then means we have an increase in threshold. So threshold again, farther away, and we decrease the steepness of the slope for phase 0 and phase 4, which would then also mean a slower heart rate. So I think that stuff's pretty cool, pretty interesting to see how that all works in the heart. We're going to move on now to the cardiac cycle. I hope you can hang with me on this one. It's not the easiest to understand, but I'm going to do my best to walk you guys through this. Okay, so what I want to first talk about is the atrium. The atriums. So before I start, I just want to make sure you guys understand that right now I'm talking just about the left ventricle. Okay. Not because I don't like the right ventricle. The left ventricle is important. Okay, so we're going to talk about this one. All right, so this all has to do with the pressure, right? If you have higher pressure, if you have two rooms that are joined up and you have a swinging door between the two, and you have a big man pushing on one side and a little child pushing on the other, one's going to win, right? It's not a perfect analogy. It's just something that came to mind. But again, if you have more pressure, then blood is going to be flowing into the other room, basically, right? So if we're just starting, let's say that the atrium is full, ventricle has just contracted, which contraction is called systole. Okay, I think I have it right here. Yeah. Systole is contraction, diastole is rest. Okay, so from where I'm starting, the ventricle is in diastole, and the atrium is just about to hit systole. Okay, so at this point, the atrium has a higher pressure than the ventricle, and so blood is just passively filling into the ventricle because the bicuspid valve, mitral valve, whatever you want to call it, is open, and so blood is just filling up in the ventricle. Okay, and then right here is this little blip that you see, and that's where your atrium contracts, atrial contraction. Okay, and then what happens is once that contracts, it pushes the last, like if it fills up the ventricle all the way. Before it filled it up to like 70 or 80%, just that passive diffusion. And then what happens is when this atrium contracts, it fills up the ventricle the last 20 to 30%. Okay, and then at that point, the ventricle now is full volume and it's starting its contraction. Okay, so it's now got a higher pressure. And when the ventricle becomes more pressurized than the atrium has higher pressure, it's gonna close the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, whatever you want to say. Okay, and so that closing of the valve causes a sound, and that's our lub. It's the closing of the atrioventricular valve, AV valve, bicuspid, mitral. Again, there's so many names. Take your pick. But that is the first sound that you hear, the lub of your lub dub. Okay? So then, this is closed. Okay? But it's clear down here. If this is pressure, then we're at like 10 millimeters of mercury. Okay? And up here is where the aorta, our semilunar valve, is. Okay? And it is high. It's clear up at 80. So when the ventricle is starting to contract right here, both valves are still closed. So this is just the ventricle squeezing. Pressure is building up because this giant muscle is starting to contract, is contracting. And so this time right here is called isovolumic contraction. Our ventricle is contracting, okay? Now, it reaches this point where it gets above the pressure of the aortic, the semilunar valve, okay? So once it gets above that pressure, it basically pops that pops the semilunar valve open, okay? So then it shoves all of that blood that was in the ventricle out into the aorta, okay? And then the aorta, because it has a bunch of pressure now in it, because it just got a whole bunch of blood, its pressure then gets bigger, okay? And so then they kind of overlap here. So then the ventricle now has no more blood in it, and then the aorta has more, okay? So kind of this area right here, I didn't draw it super well, but right here, the aorta has more pressure, and so then it closes the semilunar valve, okay? And so when that valve closes, that's our dub sound. So we only get the sounds when a valve is closing. So our first lub happens when the AV valve closes. The dub sound comes when the semilunar valve closes. Okay? And then at this point, all our volume is gone. And so now our ventricle is just relaxing. And that's isovolumic relaxation. Okay, and it relaxes all the way back down to here. And so now the atrium is higher pressure than the ventricle is. And so the AV valve opens, blood passively rushes into the ventricle, and then we start the whole process over. Now you're going to see here we have that first bump here, and then we have another little bump here. Okay, this second little bump is called a reflective wave. And that's just because we've shut the door, and then the elasticity, all that blood, it rushes towards the gate that's just closed and kind of hits it and rebounds off of it, right? And that's what we see here. Kind of the same thing up here. It's another reflective wave. So the aorta, we just had a whole bunch of blood fill it up, okay? And it's elastic, so it fills up, it stretches, and then we close the valve, and so it pushes back on the semilunar valve. That's what closes the semilunar valve, is that pushback. But again, it causes this little blip here, and it's called a reflective wave. Now this little notch right here where it closes, the semilunar valve closes, and we have this reflective wave, it's called the dicrotic notch. Okay. Now in here, this is just showing the volume of what's going on. So right in here, this is where the ventricle is filling up, right? It's just filling up with blood. This is about 80%. And then we have atrial contraction, right? And that fills up the last 20%. And then we have EDV, which stands for the end diastolic volume. So end diastolic volume means, because diastolic means rest, right? So when it's resting, the ventricle is filling up. So at the end of diastole, we have, say, 120 milliliters of blood. Okay, I think I have it right here. Yeah, 120 milliliters of blood. So the ventricle is chock full, right? Now we have contraction, isovolumic contraction. So we get rid of all of that blood, that all 120 milliliters, shove it all in, or not all of it. We can't get rid of every drop, but for the sake of this, I'm going to say we're going to get rid of all the blood in the ventricle, push it out into the aorta. Okay, and now we're at ESV, right down here, and systolic volume. So back down to, we'll say 50, right? Like I said, we can't get rid of everything. And then we start over. Now we have an influx, or it's called rapid inflow, because like I said, blood is just passively leaving the atrium, going straight into the ventricle, filling it up. Okay. So then what's important to remember is that EDV minus ESV equals SV. SV is the stroke volume, and that should be about 70 milliliters. Okay, and then cardiac output is the heart rate times the stroke volume. So about every minute, if we have 70 beats per minute and a stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat, then we're going to have about 4,900 milliliters, which is about 5 liters of blood every minute, I believe. Anyways, pretty cool. And so this is all called the cardiac cycle. Thanks for watching. I hope this all made sense. The heart is really interesting. There's lots of good stuff to understand here. I'm still working on it, but thank you so much for hanging with me.